Aye.
Okay, got that. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, since we have a larger group, we won't go around and do introductions, but we're really glad you're here. We're excited today to present two kind of national folks who have some solutions that may address some of the issues we've been facing in our COC. And first up, we have Jake Mcguire from Built for Zero. And he's going to share with us a little bit about Built for Zero's work. I know in other meetings over the past couple of months, I've talked about the great work that Built for Zero is doing, and they're very excited because their organization recently received $100 million from the MacArthur Foundation to expand the work of ending homelessness across the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jake.
Great. Thank you, Amy. It's great to be with you all. Can everyone hear me? Let me just make sure before I start. Yeah, okay, great. All right, well, I'm Jake Mcguire. I am the co-director of the Built for Zero team here at Community Solutions. I've been here, I helped launch the organization in 2010. So I've been here going on 11 years now, and really, really excited about the work that we do. And as Amy mentioned, we have this big opportunity with this 100 and change competition and this $100 million grant over 5 years. And that has sort of spurred us to think about, are there some key communities that we would really love to support over that time if they were interested? And Pinellas County is actually on that list of kind of a target community for us. And so when Amy reached out to me to just learn more about what we were doing, it was just a really welcome inquiry. And for that reason, I'm really happy to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen and chat with you a little bit, talk you through some slides that might just help us kind of understand a little bit about some of what we're learning at Built for Zero, and then a little bit about what Built for Zero looks like from a community perspective. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So can everyone see my screen?
It looks
I know
great.
some of you are on the phone, so I'll try to kind of narrate. Great. So this is a deck I built just for a community foundation, actually, but I think it's a great overview of some of our lessons, and so I'm going to use that to support this conversation as well. Just high level, so you know who you're talking to. Built for Zero is the largest team at this organization called Community Solutions. We launched in 2010, but actually spun out of a longstanding organization founded by our president, Roseanne Haggerty, called Common Ground Communities, which built affordable and supportive housing in New York City for, almost, over 20 years. Almost 3,000 units of supportive housing. We were the largest supportive housing developer in the country at the time. And I think our theory was homelessness is a housing problem. If we build more housing in this very high cost market, over time, homelessness will go down. And we built, more housing than anybody else, and homelessness didn't go down, it went up. And I think we had to sort of lean into, in a very difficult way, this question of what if this is a key piece of the problem, but what if we can't just build our way out of this problem? What if we're going to have to do more? And so we started, honestly, kind of just following folks experiencing homelessness around on the street, trying to get them to talk to us. Like, why aren't you in this housing? What are the barriers in your way? What would it take to end your homelessness? This is around the time that Housing First is really starting to go mainstream, but we also started to learn that the systems that govern access to housing were just impossibly complicated. And it was actually very, very hard for any one person or agency in a community to be responsible for homelessness overall because of how fragmented the space was and the systems were. And so we began to do some work on that problem, and over time realized, actually, we're going to have to make this the role and the work of our organization, untangling these systems. And so Pinellas participated in some of our work on what was called the 100,000 Homes campaign, and then the VA 25 Cities initiative, and so many efforts where we were trying to figure out this question of how do you accelerate the housing placement process. We helped communities do that really successfully. Communities in that work accelerated their housing placements by, on average, about 300% every month over the life of that work. And chronic homelessness in those communities didn't go down after that either. And so we had to lean in once again to this question of, okay, we've got a really good solution when it comes to supportive housing as a field. We're really starting to understand how you align systems and accelerate people's movement through those systems. And that still doesn't seem to be enough to get us the thing we really want, which is reductions in homelessness overall. And so we launched Built for Zero with a different question, and in some ways kind of the question we always meant to be trying to answer, which is, what if instead of counting up to a big number of units or counting up to a big number of housing placements, we launched an initiative that asked communities to count down all the way to zero. And we were really open and honest at the time that we didn't know how to do that. We didn't know what that was going to take. We wanted communities to learn with us. About 75 communities initially signed up to learn their way into that problem together. And over the last 5 years, we have really refined and iterated this Built for Zero model, to a place where it can support communities and driving pretty consistently reductions in homelessness. Where we are right now, just to give you an overview, and then I'll kind of launch in, is that 15 communities participating in Built for Zero have now gotten all the way to functional zero for either veteran homelessness, chronic homelessness, or both. These are the only communities in the country to do this. We're not talking about the federal criteria and benchmarks. This is a much higher bar, a sort of more objective standard. It's very, very difficult to achieve. And so it's very, very exciting to see communities driving this kind of progress. About 79% of those communities are sustaining those results month over month right now, which is another key indicator we look at. And about 50 of those communities have driven some kind of significant reduction in those populations over the time that we've all been working together. So that's kind of where we are and why we think, we have something that it might make sense to try to scale and involve more communities in. So let's take a look at kind of what it is that we're learning, and then we'll have a conversation about whether there might be opportunities for Pinellas and if it'd be a good fit. When we launched Built for Zero, I think we ran in pretty quickly to a couple key problems that communities had. Taking accountability for zero, right, for getting all the way to the end of homelessness, was pretty tough because no player in a community actually had the authority to be responsible for that problem. This is a one slide. You could probably fill 20 more with players in a typical community that touch homelessness, touch the homeless response system in some way. And some of you may come from agencies on this slide, or some of you may feel familiar with a lot of these agencies. All these agencies typically are doing really, really important work in communities. The problem is they're all funded differently. They're all managed differently. They all have different compliance incentives. None of them report to each other. And so it's actually really, really difficult to take consistent shared action over time if you're one of the agencies in this system. The question here is not, are all these agencies effectively delivering services to individual people? The real question we need to ask is, what is all that activity adding up to by way of reductions in homelessness overall across our community? And if it's not adding up to reductions, how would these groups have to work together differently to start to see that number go down? It's really hard to do that without a shared aim. And so again, when we ask communities to commit to getting all the way to zero and a shared way of measuring that, the idea is to try to give all these groups the same incentive, right? Instead of you're all accountable to your individual funders or whatever, yes, that's still going to be true, but also we're all going to agree that the purpose of our work, the goal of our work, is to get to a shared outcome across the whole community. The second challenge we saw a lot of communities struggling with and still do is that you're trying to take accountability for a system that, either some people say it's getting exactly the results it was designed to get. That's true. Some people say it was never really designed intentionally at all. That's also true. Both of these things can be true at once. And the result is, a system that's really, really hard for people to move through, again, because there are these competing and overlapping lines of authority. And if you're an individual experiencing homelessness, a lot of times you're actually the only link between all these different agencies and systems is you. And so the burden is on you to figure out, where am I supposed to go next? What's the next step of this process I'm supposed to follow? And sure, we've seen housing navigation and lots of key interventions can really help here. But actually figuring out how you streamline this whole system is really, really important for a community to be able to get reductions in homelessness over time. So this is a big challenge communities are facing. And then there's this third one, and I think this is actually the most important thing we have learned into, and it's where I want you to focus your, if you kind of remember one thing from this presentation, take this away. When we launched Built for Zero, we said, we want to see if communities can end veteran homelessness in the first year of this initiative. And what we did is we took their point in time counts, we sort of modeled those out over the last 4 or 5 years we had that data. And we used that to come up with a multiplier or a way of figuring out inflow in each community. And then we applied that to each community. So if on average your point in time count, let's say goes up, I don't know, 20% a year, then we took your current PIT count and we multiplied it by 1.2, right? So you're adding 20%. We said, all right, divide that by 12, and that's how many people you got to house every month for the next year to get to zero. We're basically trying to get to some static number that we could divide up into a rhythm of housing placements. And we had 27 communities hit that target every month for a year. And at the end of that year, we only had one community that didn't have any veterans left in front of them. And I think it was a painful moment for us of realizing that the data that communities need to actually be able to respond to this very, very dynamic problem that changes every night, that data set may actually not exist yet. And we maybe actually are going to have to figure out how to help communities build a much more reliable and much more real-time data set that they can use to start to benchmark performance. And here's an example of that. This is Chittenden County's Burlington, Vermont. So it's different, very different community than yours, obviously, but it's the city of Burlington and then a large sort of rural area around that. And their point in time count in 2019 kind of freaked everybody out because it showed this alarming 24% increase in chronic homelessness. And the county executive started getting a lot of incoming. He thought he was doing good work, and here was this big political problem for him. And so they decided to join Built for Zero. And the first thing that we did with this community is the thing that we actually do with every community that joins Built for Zero now in the beginning, which is we worked with them to get to a place where instead of looking at this number annually once a year, they could actually look at it as often as it changed. Right? So you're shifting from once a year to actually having the ability in real time to monitor and understand homelessness. When I went back a year later and just plotted that information you're just looking at the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness in Burlington month over month for that following year. I'm going to emphasize here, nothing about this system has changed in this time, right? They're just doing data work during this time. They haven't improved their system. You can see their point in time count is here. January 2019. The next month, that number is down 23%. Month after that, it's up, maybe 10%, and then down and back up to the 24% increase, and then down below. It just depends on the month that you take this poll, basically. because the number of people experiencing homelessness is so dynamic and so fluid that actually what you're seeing here is just normal variation in a system. There's no such thing as a static system. Every system has variation built in. And that's what was happening in Burlington, and it's what's happening in most places. And so once a year, you do this point in time count exercise, and everybody kind of holds their breath. And if the number goes up, everybody looks for somebody to blame. And if the number goes down, the mayor holds a press conference and tries to take credit. And actually, this information isn't really telling us anything about the nature of homelessness in our system. And it's also definitely not giving you all, as people on the ground, useful information that you would use to improve the outcomes that you're getting locally. So the question is, what would it take to shift to a system, a way of working in our communities that could actually solve for these kind of key problems? This problem of fragmentation, this problem of a system that is really painfully designed and sort of shoots and ladders, that's a poor experience for users. And then this problem of not having a feedback loop that actually tells us how we're doing and whether or not all our work on those first two problems is making anything better. What I think we have learned in Built for Zero is that that system, that kind of operating system in your community, is not about specific interventions like housing first or the way you're doing outreach or whatever. Those things are all really important, but they're actually just inputs into this broader community system. And that broader community system actually needs to have 5 key attributes. The first is this big purple box. It's the biggest because it's the most important, which is a shared aim. Every community in Built for Zero commits to a shared aim, which is functional zero. This would be everyone in your community saying, we are going to hold ourselves accountable to a shared measurable standard of how we would define zero, so that every month we can look and say, are we getting closer to that number or further away? And if we're getting further away, what do we need to change this month to see if we can course correct and start driving that number down again? The way you measure this is simple. With veterans and basically any other population other than chronic, you're not saying no one will ever have a housing crisis ever again. What you are saying is that number needs to be lower on a monthly basis than the number of people we can house that month. So in a routine month, right, if we go back and look at how many people are we housing every month, and let's say that number on average is 10, then we can never have more than 10 veterans experiencing homelessness in our community, or we are not at functional zero. We are obviously behind the curve of what our system can handle. Now, a couple of things that this is not. Some people mistake this as your outflow. How many people you're housing needs to be greater than how many people are becoming homeless. No, it's greater than the total number of people experiencing homelessness at all. So that's your inflow, and also the people that are homeless in front of you, right? So there are never more people experiencing homelessness than you've proven you can house in a routine month. For chronic homelessness, which is really a function of time, right? This is a long-term phenomenon. It takes a whole year of having somebody in your system before you categorize them as chronic, or you're seeing them over and over and over. We think chronic homelessness is basically a function of a really bad system, right? It's a system that has a whole year to manage someone's problem and still can't. And so actually we think something closer to a hard zero ought to be possible there. And so we just align here with HUD's definition, which is zero, or if not zero, in your community, it would just be 3 people. That would be functional zero for chronic homelessness. Could we get this down to 3 people? So there's a little bit of slack in our system to account for outreach challenges and things like that, but there's really not so much. We're basically trying to figure out, when we say homelessness should be brief, rare, and non-recurring, what's a really simple objective measure of that we could take every month as a community to know whether we were getting closer or further away from that aim. So you have to agree to this aim, all of you, to join Built for Zero. We're all going to hold ourselves accountable for this number. And in doing that, we're going to be shifting from just our individual program outcomes to this idea of a community-wide outcome that we want to look at on a regular basis together. You're also going to commit upfront to a shared aim around race equity. We have, in Built for Zero, really leaned into what many of us have known for a long time, but what the research in recent years has really confirmed, which is that homelessness is disproportionately a problem that victimizes people of color, and especially Black and Native folks in our communities, not just in who's likely to experience homelessness, but how people get served by the system, how long people spend in the system, who gets connected to a permanent housing outcome and who doesn't, who ends up coming back into the system and who doesn't. We are more likely and more willing in our communities to allow people of color to experience problems at just about every step of this process than we are to allow white folks to experience those problems. And so communities, when they join Built for Zero, say, we want to commit to figuring out how to make sure that people of color have system decision-making power in our systems. They're having a positive experience of using those systems when they need help. We have quality data that is not less likely to be good quality when it comes to people of color. We're just as likely to know about people's homelessness, regardless of what racial category they fall into, and that our hard system outcomes, so housing placements, returns to housing, a couple of these key things, are not disproportionately poor for Black, Native, and other folks of color. And so you have to, as a community, say that's something we want to pursue improvement against upfront. We're not going to solve that overnight, right? We didn't create this problem overnight. It took a long time, but are we willing to measure that every month? Are we willing to hold ourselves accountable for that as a system, as a whole team, and not just talk about race equity, but really have a shared measurement framework that we're pursuing as a community? So that's kind of the price of admission. Before communities get into any conversation about how they're going to do their work, they agree on what their work is supposed to achieve. And then all the conversations about what you're going to do should stem from those aims. I just want to say these things may seem simple, but getting a community on the same page about a measurable outcome up front has been transformative for the ability of communities to overcome political disagreements, old disputes over whose program should get more dollars or whatever. The goal here is to stop saying what's good for my program, or what do I think I know about my clients, and start saying, how do we see all these people as our clients, this whole community? And we're looking at a community-wide outcome together on a regular basis. If you want to pursue a community-wide outcome and you have a shared aim, now you got to integrate your team. So if we've integrated the aim, how do we integrate all the people that are working on that aim? And I think most people intuitively understand this first slide, which is we got to get everybody in a room together on a regular basis, or at least some representative team. That's not new. That might look like this meeting right now, but actually what it takes to really do improvement work across your system is not that you all just go to the same meeting. It's that you set up your structure, your team, in a way that makes it easy for you all to take collective action nimbly and quickly, right? Right now, you might all be in the same room, but actually if you wanted to take some action, there might be 50 contracts that have to be renegotiated and 20 funders you have to check with, and because you're all accountable to different people. So the question is, how do we actually set up a structure that lets us work as a team quickly and responsibly? Here's a little bit about what that looks like on Built for Zero. When communities join, they immediately start thinking about some key roles in their community. The first is this green bucket in the middle here, a team coordinator. This is, I just want to highlight right away, not necessarily someone who's in charge, right? This is someone that you all agree to allow to hold you accountable, right? Who's going to hold us accountable for the commitments we make sure we did follow up on the things we said we were going to do at a meeting, organize the meetings, make sure we're all getting together, bring the agenda, right? Sometimes that's actually the lowest level person in the room in terms of seniority, but if we're all willing to let that person keep us organized, that has a transformative effect in a community. You also want somebody playing a similar role around your data. This might be, your HMIS lead, or it might be somebody else whose job is not just to manage the data, but to look at the data on a regular basis, isolate themes, bring key topics for discussion into your meetings, and make sure that you all are having these meetings in a way that's actually data informed. And then based on what that data says, you're going to identify specific problems as a community, as a whole system that you need to solve. And the question is, do you have the flexibility, the nimbleness to stand up a quick team that might include people from a couple of your agencies to work on that problem over the next few weeks, test some ideas, figure out how we could solve that thing, manage that problem down, and then recede back into your regular day jobs and maybe stand up a different team for the new problem that's emerging, right? So it's this flexible adaptive structure that asks you to work across agencies on a regular basis and in a sustainable way, recognizing that homelessness is not siloed within your individual programs, but actually is something that spans your whole community. And so your team has to work that way as well. Finally, and this I think is really critical, we want to help you develop a rapid by name feedback loop. So you remember I said we want to move from PIT data once a year to reliable, real-time, comprehensive, and person-specific or by name data every month of the year. Comprehensive, how do we know everybody means everybody? Do we have a complete list of everyone experiencing homelessness in our community at this moment in time? Person specific, do we know their names? Do we know what makes them different from their peers? Do we know what unique resources might most benefit them and help them escape homelessness quickly? Regular updates. Every month, can we see how that person's status has changed? We can follow them through the system. Are they still in that one shelter they were staying in? Have they maybe moved on into housing? Or maybe they've receded from our radar and we're not actually sure what happened to them. And it's important for us to know that as well. And then is that data reliable? Do the inflows and outflows balance every month, just like your checkbook? We have a data quality scorecard that we help you use to get to that place. It's going to help you look at participation and coverage. Are all our providers sharing their data in one place? What are the barriers to that? What are the privacy challenges to that? How would we overcome those things? Our policies and procedures around how we manage that data. Are we all agreed on when we take someone off our list, for example? Or if someone says they're not willing to undergo an assessment, are we all agreed on how we still make sure we know about that person and can hold ourselves accountable for continuing to engage that person? And then data infrastructure. Do we actually have the technical infrastructure and the HMIS design that's going to allow us to manage and manipulate this data and look at this data on a regular basis? Our team is really skilled in helping you go through this scorecard and get to a place where you have quality real-time data. 80 communities have achieved quality real-time data across their entire community, street, shelter, or otherwise, before you. So I am confident that there is probably no problem that will come up in your community that some other community in the network hasn't solved before you, and you'll be able to leverage that information. And then finally, once you have that data, what's the point? What do you do with it? The goal is to go from looking at data as a snapshot, once a year, to something that looks more like a movie. How is homelessness moving and changing and evolving over time? Every month, what does our inflow look like? How many of these folks are brand new to homelessness? How many of them maybe have we already housed and now they're back in the picture, right? How many folks are moving out of homelessness this month? How many of those folks were housed by us versus people that maybe just disappeared or moved away? And then how many people does that leave in front of us? And is that number less than it was last month, right? So you start to understand how this problem is moving over time. And the reason this is important is that surges or spikes or changes in different categories on the screen right now might lead you to identify different kinds of problems you had to solve as a community to drive a reduction, right? If you start to see a spike in people coming back from housing placements, for example, your response is probably going to be really different than if you start to see a major surge in people that you've never seen in the homeless response system before at all, right? Those might be different leverage points, different interventions. The question is, do you as a community have the ability to see that so you all can have a problem-solving conversation in this new team structure that you built for responding to that challenge? I just want to close by giving you kind of an example of what you can do when you have this kind of nimble structure and this kind of information on a regular basis. This is Chattanooga, their full metro area. So it's the city of Chattanooga plus 4, I think, surrounding rural counties. It's about 1 million people, so it's not nothing. This is their month-over-month data on veteran homelessness. That's what you're looking at here. Every one of these dots is just how many veterans were homeless that month in our community. As you can see, that number's kind of dancing around for a little bit. And as they start to drill down into that data, they really identify that the longest part of their housing process, remember that slide about design, system design, the longest part of their housing process is once people have a voucher, it's taken them a really long time to lease that voucher up. And that's common, a lot of communities see that. So the question they have is that because we don't have enough units, or is it because we don't have enough landlords? What they decide is, let's test the landlord thing before we test the unit thing, because it's a lot easier to try to recruit landlords than to build new housing. They spend a couple months testing some ideas on landlord engagement. Their first ideas don't really work, and this number's not really moving. But eventually they find a way to engage landlords that's pretty powerful, and they start to see a lot of landlords come into the voucher lease up process. And you can see, it's pretty intuitive. I don't even have to point it out, where they start to drive a pretty dramatic reduction in veteran homelessness month over month in that community, right? And then in June of that year, you start to see that number start to tick up a little bit. It's not dramatic, but it's going up, and they want to jump on that pretty quickly. Just like with COVID cases or anything else we track in real time. They want to be able to say, wait a minute, what's going on? How do we arrest this trend before it takes over? So they dig down into their data to understand where that's coming from. And they use this data visualization platform that we make available to all our communities for free. This is built in partnership with Tableau. It's one of our national partners. This is an infrastructure you'll have access to. Don't worry about interpreting this chart for now, but what this chart basically shows them is that, hey, we've got a bunch of people coming in that we've never seen before, but actually our housing rate, we're keeping up with those folks. We're getting them back into housing pretty quickly. But what we're not keeping up with is a quarter of our new inflow is people we already housed, and now here they are back on the radar. Well, that's about triple the national average when we look at the data. So that's not good system performance in that community. It's not good if a quarter of the people you're seeing homeless every month are people you already solved homelessness for and something didn't take. Here they are back in your system. So they call together their housing providers and they say, give us some qualitative information. What's under this data point, right? What's going on? And what they find is one of their providers is killing it, getting great program outcomes. Their grants get renewed year after year, and they have a huge ratio of case management to people in that program. And then they've got a couple other programs that are really, really struggling. And all of their retention problems are coming from those programs. And when they look at those case management ratios in those programs, they are dramatically understaffed, right? And that's because that's how we're incentivized as a community. We're incentivized to operate in these programmatic silos, where if I can demonstrate good program outcomes, I get more money to help the people that happen to connect to my program. But actually, when we shift and say we have a shared aim, which is a community reduction, we become open to conversations about how to right-size things like case management across our programmatic institutions. And that's what happens in Chattanooga, is that program that has more case management than it needs says, let's renegotiate this contract, let's move some of this capacity over, let's right-size these ratios. And lo and behold, very quickly, they are able to bend the curve on that inflow across all three of those programs. And this is Chattanooga about 8 months later, when they finally get all the way to functional zero on veteran homelessness, which they've now sustained for several months since that achievement. So it's not always just one thing. I don't mean to imply that there's a silver bullet, but when you have an integrated team with a shared aim and regular real-time data that you have faith in, right? So you all have a shared source of ground truth, you can do a kind of system level problem solving that you can't do when you're all working in programmatic silos or focused on your compliance and funding structures, right? It creates an opportunity for a different kind of conversation. And in turn, that enables different kinds of collective action. And that is how all the communities that we are supporting that are seeing these population level reductions are getting those results. They're not getting more money. They're not just building new housing. We have all the data on all those things. What they're doing is organizing themselves in a different way that gives them a level of problem solving control that they didn't have before. So I think the opportunity in Pinellas would be to think about what would it look like to engage some support that would help us figure out how to organize ourselves this way. And some of this you may say, I think we're already pretty good in that area. And some of this you may be saying, oh, that's a place I think we'd have to do some work as a team if we really wanted to work in this nimble, agile way. The Built for Zero Collaborative, which is the support vehicle you'd be joining, we're not a TA provider. It's not, we don't take government funding. We don't make money off this. This would just be if you feel like it's supportive to you. You would join a cohort initially that's focused on building that team, that structure that allows your team to take action quickly, and then getting to that quality data set. So you can really start to see what's going on across your community. And then once you've achieved that, you'd move into a cohort that's focusing on using that data and that team structure to try to drive reductions. And depending on what sorts of problems your data is showing you, right? Every community is different. We'll provide you support around different kinds of interventions that would be most appropriate to solve that problem. And you'll do that work with other communities that are also focused on those specific interventions. So you can learn from communities, from our dedicated coaches who will be assigned to your team to provide support, and using this data platform that I shared to help you make decisions. And then at some point, you're gonna drive reductions in homelessness and in chronic and veteran homelessness, I'm confident. And you're gonna hit what we call the last mile, which is when you get down to maybe the last 10% of your folks, and what it takes to get those folks off the street is often just really different than what it takes to house everybody else. It's just harder, and it's not about the things that got you that first 90% reduction. You gotta break the rules, you gotta try something new. And in that phase, our funders and investors have come alongside us to say, we want to make it possible when communities reach that moment for them to unlock new flexible dollars that are not tied to federal compliance, that are not tied to anybody else's vision of what needs to happen except that community's vision. And the goal or the outcome we want to put on that grant is not that you execute a specific activity, but that you get to zero in your community. So you're going to get money, hopefully, we'll guarantee that, but if you enter that cohort, you have an opportunity to get some flexible dollars to solve the final barriers in your specific community, with the outcome being that you get all the way to zero with those dollars. When you've done that, you'll enter our sort of final cohort, which is called Zero for All, which is a cohort of communities that have gotten to zero for one population. And now they're focused on figuring out how to sustain that result and scale it to everybody else and get to an end to all homelessness in their communities. And we have one community, and I won't blow up their spot and mention who, that we think will be the first community in the country this year to get to an end, a measurable end to all homelessness, which is really, really exciting. And I'd love to see Pinellas be able to move through these cohorts and get to that place as well. So let me just take a pause and see if you have questions. I know it's a whole lot. It's a different way of thinking and working, and it's a lot to digest at once. Luckily, we don't have to make a decision on this call, but I'd love to just see what kinds of questions and ideas this is sparking for people, and offer you whatever information I can to help you think about if this would be helpful in your community.
Thank you so much, Jake. So feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and ask any questions you may have. I see April unmuted and waiting for somebody else to be the first to speak, and it's still not happening.
Okay,
Come on, April.
I'll go. So Jake, thank you so much. This honestly was amazing. I absolutely loved your presentation, your energy, just the way you explain things. It just, you know, it felt so, the approach just feels so different than many of the approaches that have historically been used to try to solve problems, which is often pitting providers against each other as opposed to, you know, structuring it so that we all, in fact, are working towards the same aim, towards the same goal. I loved that in the way you've described this, that there's no, you know, finger pointing, that it really is all of us, and that when the data starts to say something is wrong, that we all gather and try to figure it out, as opposed to, you know, trying to see who we're not going to fund anymore, right? whose funding we're taking away, and instead we're invested in the outcome. When you talked about you know, no more people are homeless than you have space for, right, in that beginning part of your presentation, are you talking about permanently housed, or are you talking about an emergency shelter, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. That definition, which is not easy to achieve, so I don't want to make it sound easy, but is people who are permanently housed. So anyone who's, you know, someone is still in shelter, if they're in transitional program, anything that would still categorize that person as homeless by like a HUD standard, right? If they'd be homeless on your point in time count, for example, or a veteran in GPD, for example, they're still experiencing homelessness in your community. And so what that definition says is we actually want to get to a place where we don't have any more folks in that situation than we know we can house in a single month. And also one more thing is, and you may not have meant it this way, but just let me clarify that it's not about your capacity, like how many units we have available or something like that, but it's about the performance of your actual system. So if we have, let's say, 10 veterans who are experiencing homelessness, and we know we have 10 units available this month, but if we're not actually operationalizing the connection between that veteran and that unit at that rate every month, then we're not at functional zero. It's not about how much housing we have. It's about how many people we're putting in housing, we're connecting to housing every month. So we've actually got to really do the thing at a rate that's larger than the number of people that need the thing. That's the idea.
Yeah, right. And so what is the catch to participating in this? I mean, you know, can we just cut to the chase on what the catch is?
So well, my signing fee is $1 million. No, I'm just kidding.
I'll jump in for a second. So there is a one-time fee, which Jake will mention. We have already secured the funding for that one-time fee. But as he mentioned, they don't just let me say, hey, this is a great idea and we should do it, because it's a collective solution. And so a part of the goal of presenting this to the group today is to say, are we willing to take the leap and work in this kind of way? And do we want to bring to the board an official vote on that? So it's $10,000 for a one-time entry fee. So there's skin in the game, and then you can participate year after year and go through all the cohorts.
Yeah, that's right. After a year, if you say, hey, thanks, but this wasn't super helpful, fine. And after a year, if you say, this is awesome, we want to keep going, you never pay again. It's honestly, we used to just make it free, and it was underwritten by our funders. And we saw that communities would join kind of lightly, you know. It didn't do the work to really make sure they had buy-in, that they were really serious about this. And so when we put a nominal fee in place, we saw that communities were able to get better results because they had to do some organizing work up front. And so I'm just really transparent about that, but that's why that fee exists. It doesn't cover even close to the cost of supporting you, but our funders do that. So we're not too worried about that. Yeah. I see Julie, it looks like, with a question.
Hey, yes, thanks. First of all, Margie, thank you for helping to facilitate getting us all together. I know that wasn't an easy task, so thank you so much. And Jake, thanks for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is super for me, personal, local, and the media. I'm really excited to hear what you shared. I think it's really bold and aspirational for a community to galvanize and coalesce in a unified way like this. And I'm curious, it appears like you have created a framework. How far removed is each community from replication? So how do you make it unique to your community and also create the fidelity of the model that proven success?
It's a great question. We get it a lot. I mean, I think what's at stake here, what's in play for you all, is this shift from treating homelessness as what I'll call a technical problem, which is like, we have to do these 5 things or find the right recipe, and if we just implement these best practices, homelessness will go away, to seeing homelessness as what I would call a complex problem, which means the data is changing all the time. Actually, there isn't one silver bullet. What we need is some way of staying engaged with this problem. The analogy, I think, is like raising kids, right? You can't just do the same thing with every kid. You've got to stay engaged with that kid, and you're adjusting all the time to meet that challenge where it's at. And that's the system you need in your community. And so, so what's replicable is that kind of iterative approach to using that data to see, how is the problem changing in our community this month? How does it look different in our community? What does that mean about where we might have to focus? And then what are some of the strategies and tools we can use to kind of put new ideas in the field quickly, see if they're working in our community? What is not replicable is whatever you learn about what this takes in your community. That doesn't mean we just want to go and export that to every other community, because other communities have problems that might look different than yours. And they also might have problems that are similar to some of yours. And so you have the benefit of this network and being able to swap learning and collaborate with other communities. But then the obligation to figure out, how would we adapt that thing that was so successful for them in, Jacksonville or, Fresno or whatever, so that it can work in Pinellas? And then how would we look at our data to know if in fact that thing is working? And you're also shifting from this mindset of, we'll know if it's working based on whether or not the people that touch that intervention are getting housed, to, we'll know if it's working based on whether or not there are fewer of those people needing help over time across our whole community. It's possible. It sounds crazy, but one of the things we learned the hard way is it's possible to run really great programs that get really great housing placement outcomes and not actually be contributing to a reduction in homelessness across a community. And sometimes programs realize, oh, the thing I would have to do to contribute maximally to a reduction in this community is different than the thing that's just getting me great program outcomes that allow me to be competitive for my funding and serve my clients well every year. And that's a weird shift to have to make, but that's what we want to enable in your community. So I hope that answers the question. That the way of working, I think, is the thing that's replicable, the way of problem solving. The actual fodder for that problem solving, the inputs into that problem solving, may be very unique to your community in some cases. And that's because this problem is different in different places.
Jake, I have another question. How do communities go about choosing the initial population for functional zero?
Sure. We ask all our communities to start with either chronic or veterans. So that's where you start. I just want to be clear, there's no magic to those. Those aren't populations more deserving of support or anything like that. It's just, it's very, very hard to shift to a different way of working across a whole system at scale, right? It's much easier to cut your teeth on a small piece of this problem where you can, what we call sometimes, shrink the change and figure out how would we learn in a smaller scale and then scale those learnings out. So communities pick those, and the reason they do that is veterans is often because there's a lot more political will, because there are some dedicated resources through VA. Sometimes that can be a place where you can move a lot faster and get kind of a quick win. And so that can be useful in some communities, or chronic homelessness is often the hardest part of this problem for communities. And so some communities take the opposite tack and they say, we actually just want to start with the biggest boulder, the hardest piece of this problem. And if we could solve it for that population, we think we would have learned what it takes to solve it for a lot of other groups. So that's a decision for you all to make. It's really important though that you're creating a way for your family providers, your youth providers, providers that might be serving all singles, not necessarily just chronic or vets, to come along on this journey. Because once you get to zero in one of these populations, you're going to want to be saying, how do we scale what we just learned to support all these other populations quickly as well? And that work on those populations is not going to stop in the meantime. Your youth providers are going to keep serving youth. Your family providers are going to keep serving families, and that's important. So you want to create this ability for that information, that knowledge to be flowing back and forth, so that you're not, increasing the silos in your system. And we can help you do that. We do that work with a lot of communities.
Trinia?
Yes, thank you. This is so exciting, and I certainly want to thank you, Amy, and everybody else who's been a part of it to share this particular model with us. I think this is exactly what we need here in Pinellas County. So I'm certainly supportive of us making this investment, this journey. I like the fact that we're looking at not just programmatic outcomes, we're looking at community level outcomes. That's exciting. And I was just curious, though, as to what kind of organizational barriers did you run into? The whole notion of flexibility funding or not looking at programmatic outcomes. What did you run into, and how were you able to, shall we say, put that in check and move forward to the community change? I'm curious.
It's the elephant in the room, Trinia. It's really tough. I mean,
Tell me.
Here's what I want to say. It's really hard, and it's not hard because of anything any of y'all are doing. I mean, this is how our sector got set up. It got set up in these little silos where we kind of parcel out the money across all these different, and nobody actually has the ability to step forward and take responsibility. Even Amy or the COC, I mean, that's kind of the closest we have to maybe a unifying player. And actually, even that, I mean, think about the veteran system, or even within the veteran system, GPD is separate from, I mean, it's all these silos. And so it's really tough to do this. So like, I just want to be clear, this is going to take you some time and some work and some pain and sometimes some tears, but it's in the interest of people experiencing homelessness that we figure out how to work this way. I think that's what's important here. So it is hard, but we got to go there. A couple of things that I think help. One is when you get to share data, a lot of times the reason these arguments just go round and round in circles and we never change is because there's no shared source of truth. If we can get to shared data on what's happening across these populations, we can start to have one conversation. I'll be honest, even just the work it takes to get to shared data is going to force you to integrate some of these silos. And so it's a bit of a Trojan horse for almost like making you start to do that collaboration on the front end, which is maybe a secret I'm not supposed to tell you, but that is part of what happens here. I think the other place that you'll run into challenges is your compliance obligations don't go away. Just Amy still has to manage all the COC funding compliance and put forward the ranking review team still got to do its job, and the system performance measures aren't really aligned with this way of thinking, a little bit, but not quite. And so you're going to have a lot of masters that you have to serve still. And that is where leadership comes in, and you're all going to need to figure out how do we step up and stay focused on that aim. I think you all ought to consider it a failure, in my opinion, if you're doing really, really good work and your funding is increasing and you're getting more money from HUD and whatever and all these things, and the number of people experiencing homelessness in your community isn't going down over time. That's got to be the point, And there's some pieces of that you can't control, like inflow, but this is going to help you start to move upstream and see that better. So it's just, the first step is, are we willing to commit to that goal and to figuring out what it would take to do that collaboration? And can we hang together when it comes down to actually having to figure it out? And if you're willing, I think there are roads that communities before you have cleared for how to navigate some of those institutional challenges. But I think you'll run into some of them, I mean, GPD is a really hard one, for example. I don't know if there are any GPD providers on this call. It's a critical resource we have in our communities. We know it also, as veteran homelessness continues to reduce, those beds are going to be less full, and those providers have to figure out how to be able to deliver their services in a more flexible way. But actually, the funding structures and the compliance structures don't allow them to do that. And so as a community, you're going to have to figure out, how do we support this resource that can continue to play an important role in our community, and not vilify it, which we see happen sometimes in communities, but instead figure out, how do we act as one system in a way that can help everybody stay whole and get the best results for people experiencing homelessness. So there's no one answer to that problem, but a shared aim will go a long way to helping you get there. So that's a long answer to your question, and it's also kind of a non-answer to your question. Let me just own that. But it's where you got to start, I think. So
Thank you.
Jake, I think it's really helpful to hear, I think you and I talked about every community in national projects thinks they're different, and they're actually not, right? Our challenges are often the same. And you just reinforce that our veterans numbers are going in the wrong way. GPD is a part of that equation, even here locally. So for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a per diem rate for the bed. And that it's the way that funding structure is built is people want to hold on to those dollars, and it makes it difficult. So I think you reinforce the idea that there are other communities that are struggling with some of the things that we are,
but also solving them. I just want to emphasize that. I mean, we're in Detroit, for example, where they have more GPD beds right now than they have total homeless veterans in the entire community. So we're going to have to figure out how to restructure those programs and create new opportunities for those programs, or else veteran homelessness is going to permanently be at 160, which is where it is right now. So in Detroit, we're figuring out with some of those providers, what would it look like to bring our real estate team in to help you figure out how to convert this facility to permanent housing so you could get revenue that way and serve veterans in a different way? Or what would it look like to use our relationships at the national VA to get you program waivers so that you can serve non-homeless veterans with these services, or to deliver the case management on behalf of your VASH vouchers? I mean, there are all kinds of roles for these programs if we can fix the way we've set ourselves up. And so that's the challenge here, but anyway, in Detroit, they're seeing those numbers go down, and everybody's still whole and everybody's still contributing. So I think there are ways to do this.
Okay, we only have a few more minutes with Jake. Any final questions?
Yeah, one quick question. This is Sam. I'm the faith-based seat in the board. One of the things that I think we have to do to get to zero in any way is engaging the broader community. I mean, we have great providers in the room, and I think we can work on breaking down silos together and share resources better. But I'm curious what your experience is in terms of broadening that engagement to the broader community. That's where the money is to solve this problem, and the will.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's really important. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is I'm often shocked by how little connection there is in communities between the homeless response system and the sort of city and county government systems. Every community is different, but a lot of times those systems are able to be totally siloed. Bringing your mayor or your county executive into this work so that they can use their bully pulpit, their convening power, is really helpful. That becomes especially true if you start to want to cite new housing or things like that. You need somebody who can push that through. I think you need the public believing that this is possible. I actually think the biggest barrier to homelessness is we all just kind of think it's intractable, and that it's always been here, which it hasn't, and it will always be here, which it doesn't have to. And so how do we get people open to the idea that you could solve this problem instead of just manage it? So communications becomes really important in sharing your successes. The other thing I think is you need healthcare institutions and other anchor institutions in your communities to feel like they have a credible partner in you. Like, you're not going to get data sharing opened up between healthcare and homeless systems, for example, unless the healthcare system, which has extremely complex, rigid, and sophisticated data protocols, believes they have an equally sophisticated partner on the homeless response system side. And in most communities right now, they don't. And so collaboration between those institutions is really hard. If you start getting to this level of data quality, and I would actually urge you to even start posting that run chart, that graph I showed you, on a public website every month, so the whole community can say, I know exactly how many veterans or whatever it is are experiencing homelessness this month. I can see if that number's going in the right or wrong direction. I can see the inflow, the outflow. you're going to open up new lines of kind of credibility with some of your outside partners. And the last thing, we didn't talk about this, but the way that the Built for Zero Collaborative works is, you'll build this team and then you will come to a huge in-person event. The next one will be in December. We call it a learning session. They happen twice a year. We bring every single community in the collaborative, that's 110 communities, together in one place, a team of 4 or 5 people from each community, to do this work together, to look at your data, to go deep, to engage other communities and learn about how they solve challenges you're having, to get trained up in how to do race equity work in a meaningful way, which isn't skills we were born with. And it's really hard to make that pivot. So this is an environment where you can invite some of those outside stakeholders to come in to an environment that's facilitated by a neutral third party, and let us do the work to kind of help y'all get carried along. And then you go home having had this shared experience and with some energy and some strong partnerships that you can carry into implementing some of the action planning that you did at that event. So that's twice a year, and then 6 months in between where you're implementing with our coaches on the line with you on a regular basis. And then 6 months later, come back in person, look at the data, see what happened, do it all over again. So we're building this rhythm of, we work in these 6-month cycles, and that offers us opportunities to constantly be engaging partners as we go. So yeah. Anything, one last question before I go?
Do you mind answering the question I put in the chat, Jake, around community benefits agreement?
Sure. Are you talking about healthcare dollars specifically, or make sure I understand what you're speaking to?
Amy, maybe you could explain it.
I mean, the only way I'm familiar with community benefits agreement is city government uses community benefits agreements whenever we're looking to put city dollars towards redevelopment of land, and that the developer then has to agree to do certain things in order to get those dollars from the city.
I see.
Is that what you're talking about, Julie?
Yeah, so I was just kind of curious from a model of funding or support for this effort.
Yeah.
And particularly around development dollars or wraparound services. Many other communities use that mechanism.
I think it's an interesting question though, Julie, because I think that I want to wrap my brain around it, because I think what Amy said is, when you do CBAs, can you do it in that specific of a use? I think it's interesting. Good question though. I just, not to jump in, sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't, it's something I could look into for you. I don't know deeply, I try to always still be coaching at least one community. So I'm sort of still close to the ground, but it's just one community of 110. So I could ask around and see if folks are seeing that or engaging that. I do know that folks are trying to figure out how to leverage, state and local dollars and private sector dollars as well. And there are a lot of different ways, depending on the community, that can be structured, or, that's already happening. There are also a lot of dollars that are coming through agreements like that are not, being taken advantage of in a population level frame, right? So they're being taken advantage of to, well, if I build this building, I have to create X number of affordable units or something like that. It's like, okay, but how is that calculation connected to our sense of what it would take to solve the problem over time, right? How are we connecting that to a system that's designed to get reductions? And so sometimes you can try to sync these processes up and try to bring them into better conversation. And I'd be happy to talk more at some point about some of the examples we're seeing of that. You probably don't have time here, but yeah. So I'll ask around, and if I find out anything, I'll let Amy know, and she could share that with you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
It is a good idea, Julie.
Cool.
Any final questions? Jake, thank you so much. I have been like waiting after you and I spoke and seeing the presentation the first time to be able to share this with everyone. And cool. I'm just really excited about our conversation to get started on this important work.
That's awesome. Let me just close by sharing a little bit on timeline. The next learning session is either be November or December. We're trying to finalize it now. We're really hopeful that we'll be able to have an in-person learning session finally. Stay tuned on that, but I think we're close. And so what that would mean is we need to know the communities that are attempting to join several months in advance, so we can start to work with you to build the right team and figure out who's coming to that event versus who's going to stay home and be ready to get learning when that team gets back, that kind of thing. It's also true that we have put a cap on the number of communities that we're going to work with in this model, and we have a kind of a priority list, as I said, but that list is bigger than we have slots. And we're close. We've got about 7 of those slots left, which is not, I feel weird having this conversation, but that's where we are. So if you all want to decide somewhat quickly, to the extent that you can, whether this is an opportunity you'd like to take advantage of, I recommend you do that in the next couple of weeks if possible. We're definitely trying to hold a spot for Pinellas. I think this feels like a priority community for us. But it's also true there are other communities that are interested. So no pressure or scarcity. I don't mean to create that, but just for our capacity, that's a decision we've made. So I want to be transparent about that with you. So I hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you, Jake. That's super helpful.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Very good.
Okay, so we are going to have time to discuss that and other things at the end. But next, I want to invite Tiffany Peng. Margie, have you made Tiffany a presenter?
I wasn't sure if I needed to, but I will do it right now.
Yes, thank you. So Tiffany is the founder of Outreach Grid. And some of you have heard us talk about this in other committee meetings as a possible software solution or platform that wouldn't necessarily replace HMIS, but could be overlaid on top of it to make a more user-friendly entry into HMIS, and also may solve some of the problems that our local hospitals have with discharge planning. And so I'm really excited for Tiffany to share with you a little bit more about Outreach Grid and actually show you how user intuitive it is. We've had so many conversations in the last couple of months about how hard it is to make HMIS do the things folks need it to do, especially when they're in the field. So I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany now.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Peng. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Outreach Grid. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you all for taking the time to learn more about Outreach Grid. I know you guys just came out of another presentation, so thank you. Thank you. So for our agenda today, we're going to go over what Outreach Grid is about, some of its features, and some examples of how we've solved our community's biggest challenges. So to start, Outreach Grid is a coordinated entry platform that enables a region, a COC, a county, a group of cities, a group of agencies to collaborate on homelessness from first contact to housing in one platform in one language. It includes tools for outreach workers, for them to communicate with shelter operators, for shelter operators themselves, to housing navigators or case managers, and to supportive housing operators. And we're able to measure the flow of an individual's experience in homelessness, from first contact in outreach all the way through to housing to see how they're moving along in their journey out of homelessness. Now, what's unique about Outreach Grid is we were built from the ground up. Every line of code that went into Outreach Grid was coded between myself and my co-founder and our engineering team. That's in-house. We started out as a civic technology program. And if you're not too familiar with that, we started that in 2016 with a program called Startup in Residence. And Startup in Residence was a program that came out of the late Mayor Ed Lee's office in San Francisco that paired up-and-coming startups with cities that had very technological challenges. And one such challenge that we rose to was homelessness. How do we integrate data about homelessness? How do we make it make sense to the end users, the people who are in the field working with people experiencing homelessness? So we worked alongside nonprofit agencies. We've worked alongside government agencies to build tools that they can use out in the field, that they can use to facilitate communications within their own agency and also between agencies. And also allow them to be able to use it for reporting purposes. What's also unique about Outreach Grid is every member of our team, including the engineering team, including leadership, every member of our team has done some form of shadowing. They've done outreach before. We've shadowed, outreach workers, law enforcement agencies, code enforcement agencies. We've worked really closely with shelter operators that are just opening up their shelters to shelters that have been around for decades. We visited supportive housing programs and talked to housing navigators and case managers, to leaders of COCs, to members of Congress. So we've gone to the UN and worked with groups that are dedicated towards ending homelessness at the United Nations level to really understand what work needs to be done to end homelessness using technology. And Outreach Grid is the product of those 5 years of conversations. Many times we hear that, HMIS doesn't really satisfy what we need. In my conversations with Amy, that's also what I heard, that they're in search of other methods to collect data that they want at the point of work. So when you're doing work, you have access to information that you need, and you're able to add to that information. And many times we also hear that communities want to collaborate with each other, that they want to work with each other, and for whatever reasons, they cannot. And Outreach Grid lowers the barriers for collaboration with tools that are built specifically for collaboration between agencies. And one of the big reasons we go into our communities to shadow them and to understand it is so that in our office, when we build and code this platform, we're able to code very empathetically. We're able to understand the end user's experience, and we get their feedback, and we continuously iterate and improve the system. So to start, we have our encampment tools, and these are used specifically or primarily by outreach folks, so outreach specialists, public safety officers, code enforcement folks. This is available on mobile web and also on iOS. You simply use your phone's geolocation services, drop a pin on a map, and then the system actually helps you try to generate a name for the encampment based on landmarks that are close to the point that you've dropped it in, and you can enter in some information about that location. And once you've created an encampment, you have access to its status. You can update its status, whether it's active, inactive, or it's just completely gone. Excuse me. And you also have access to a timeline to see what other agencies have visited this location, who, when, and where, and add pictures to them. And you can see in a very clear timeline, what work has been done. In addition to that, you can also add in observations about the encampment, and these are customizable fields. So we recognize that different communities have different concerns about their encampments. You can log how many people were observed, whether there were any hazards like dogs, guns, or knives, whether they're interested in services or not interested in services, whether there were any express mental or medical emergencies or needing help. Those are things you can tick off. And in addition to that, you can also associate encampments to a client, and I'll touch upon that once I go into client management tools. In addition to encampment tools, we also have point in time count tools. So this is all integrated into the Outreach Grid platform. You're able to create point in time count events, as many or as few as you like. I understand organizing point in time counts is a thing. It takes a long time. And we have apps available in iOS and in Android for volunteers to download. They simply download the app, they punch in the code that's related to your event, and then they'll have access to the questions that your community wants to do. So we have the normal template of questions that HUD provides, but if you have any additional questions that you want to add, those come at no extra cost. You can even add those questions yourselves through our platform. So if you have custom questions, you simply add them on. We have logic for answer branching. So if there's logic of like, you you ask, are you from the Houston area? And if you say yes or no, they will send you to another type of question. Those types of logic is handled in the system itself. And you can add those questions as you need them. And I'll give you an example of how we did that recently in a mini pit count in one of our communities. Now, on the flip side, we also have a command center for the organizers and administrators of the pit count. So you're able to see in real time as surveys are coming in, where they're popping up from, who's the volunteer who's putting the information in, and you can see and review the survey in real time. You're also able to assign participants or volunteers to specific teams so that they can see, the specific region that they care about and any hot spots that might be related to that region. Like this. So when they sign up, they're assigned to a certain team, pit team A, and then they're assigned this quadrant in the park. And those are the 3 hot spots that they should visit. And then they can go through the flow of creating the surveys. In addition to the tools that we've made for volunteers and for the organizers of the event, we also have volunteer training and promotional materials. So we have training videos on YouTube that you can send out to your volunteers to get trained up. It onboards them, teaching them how to download the app, how to punch in the code, how to go through the flow of the survey so that you can do your trainings remotely and you don't have to schedule 200, 300 folks in a room and have them do it all right then and there. We also have volunteer materials like posters and flyers and those kinds of things that are readily available for download. All right, let's make sure this video plays. All right, so in addition to point in time count tools, we also have client management tools, and this is used by specialists from across the spectrum, from outreach all the way through to housing. You might be familiar with this form. This is our Universal Identifier Elements form. This is the HUD intake form. You go through the form, and then at the end, you're able to, let me try playing this again. You're able to turn the phone around and show them the release of information waivers, and you can have multiple languages. So our app supports multiple languages. You can toggle between them for English and Spanish or whatever other versions of it that you might have. And then at the end of it, there's also a signature pad for them to sign in the tablet and in the phone itself. So your outreach workers or your case managers, they can do their intake very simply by turning their tablet and their phone around. And just like with encampments, once you have created a client, you have access to their client profile, either both their public profile and their private profile. Now, in their public profile, you're able to see a timeline of things that were done publicly for this client. So someone encountered them at a certain location, a resident shelter intake form was created for them, project enrollment stuff was done for them. And private profile includes information that's exclusive only to people inside of your agency, and public is information that is shared with all agencies in the network. And these are per agency. You can also toggle who sees what kind of information, and that is up to the agreement that your continuum of care or the network of agencies that you're working with would agree to. In addition to the HUD, the standard HUD assessments that they ask folks to do, like the HUD financials and the demographic information, we also have custom client assessments that would be specific to your community. And one such type of assessment is the shelter preference form. And this also ties into a feature I'll touch upon called Shelter Bed Reservation and Management Tool. So the shelter preference form allows you to punch in on behalf of a client the type of bed that they would like, whether they're coming in with a pet, whether they are requiring ADA assistance, whether they are requiring a top bunk or a bottom bunk, a couple's bed, singles bed, whatever it is. Do you mind if your bed is next to a wall? So those kind of questions you can put into Outreach Grid, and based on logic that either we help you compose or you tell us to compose, they'll automatically generate a tag on the client's profile to say, this is a person who prefers a bottom bunk, and also based on previous assessments done, this person is also a veteran. So these characteristics about a client is easily shown on a client's profile, and they're also automatically generated as assessments are filled out. So you don't have to think like, you know, did they fill out the assessment here? I should think of him as a bottom bunk person here. As I mentioned earlier, you can also associate a client to a specific location. So if you're meeting them at a Starbucks, you can record an encounter that you had with a client, or you can associate them to an encampment that, that you visited. And at each location, at each encounter, you're also able to note the type of resources that were dispensed to them. So if you gave them a bus pass, if you gave them a hygiene kit, a bottle of water, whatever resource that you want to note that you had given to the individual, you can note them here, so that you can in the future run reports about, you know, this person had 7 bus passes in the past month. And you can sort of see at a network level how much resources was given to an individual. All right, now I'll move into shelter bed management and reservation system. This is used primarily between outreach folks and shelter folks. So outreach specialists and shelter operators, and even public safety officers who might be, you know, on a daily basis encountering people experiencing homelessness and wanting to refer them into a shelter and move them, you know, from the streets to shelter. So how it works is the requester, usually an outreach specialist or a public safety officer, fills out the shelter preference form to assess the client's needs. So, you know, do you want top bunk, bottom bunk? Are you coming in with a pet? And then they have access to their reservable inventories. So reservable inventories is the inventories of beds that are made available to them to request against. And I'll give you an example of why this logic is particularly important. Certain agencies pay into a shelter for X amount of beds, and they want those X amount of beds to be just theirs. And so in Outreach Grid, that allows for that logic to be had. This is based on, you know, feedback and our outreaches and our, you know, shadowing shelter operators. This is how we glean this information, that there are certain inventories that should be seen by agency X, but not agency Y. So once you're in your reservable inventories, you can see the availabilities of the different types of beds and the different types of beds that are available in that shelter. And the requester can then request a reservation for a client. The system itself will tell you whether this is a match or not a match to the current availability of the beds. So if Alina is a veteran, but there are no veteran beds available, the system will tell you that it's not a match. Or if there are veteran beds that are available, it will tell you that it is a match. And once the request is submitted, it goes to the shelter operator, who then receives the request. They get a notification by phone, by email, and also in the platform itself, letting them know that a new request has come in. And so the shelter operator can then either accept it or reject it. And if they accept it, they set a time window during which the client can be brought in. This is a lot like, you know, hotels.com, booking.com, you're reserving like a hotel kind of thing. And you're setting the time during which a client can be brought in. Once that's been set, it gets sent back to the original requester. They receive a notification by email, by phone, and in the platform itself about their check-in time. And once the client has been brought in, the shelter operator assigns them to the appropriate bed. And that updates the availability of all the beds in the system. And then the shelter operator can use QR codes that are made available per bed to scan into them and reassign them to a different bed to make sure that they're still using the bed, or if they've exited, to exit them to the appropriate destination. And these are all HUD exit destinations. So to recap, how it works is the outreach worker checks for the availability of the best match beds. They make a request for the reservation. The shelter operator confirms the request for reservation, and upon their arrival, upon the client's arrival, the shelter operator assigns them to an available bed that updates the availability of the bed. They continuously update the availability, and that restarts the virtuous cycle. And that information is then propagated back to the outreach worker, who can then restart the process. To give an example of one of the first shelters that we launched, it was in Buena Park, California. It was called the Buena Park Navigation Center. It looks like this at start. There's like little dividers between the beds. It was completely brand new. The beds were literally still in the bags. And on each corner of the dividers, there was a little QR code that we went in and like stamped out on each bed, so that shelter operators can scan that QR code, quickly pull up the page for that bed and for that individual, and update the availability of the bed. Just to give a little context about this particular feature, as a result of rolling out this feature, we've saved communities hundreds of hours of work. And we'll touch upon this in our case studies in our at the last bit of our presentation. We conceived and coded this feature based on feedback and shadowing and seeing how the process currently works. There was no like external funding that told us to build something like this. This was our mission as Outreach Grid is to end homelessness. So we saw that there was a need for something like this, and we built it from scratch. And we launched this feature last year. And to date, we have 6 shelters and 450 beds on our network, all of them onboarded last year in the midst of the pandemic. So I think that was pretty cool experience to go through, helping these navigation centers come on board and digitize their reservation process. In addition to navigation center tools, shelter bed tools, we also have housing tools, and this is primarily used by case managers, housing navigators, and supportive housing operators. You're able to list properties that you found on either Zillow or Redfin or Craigslist, indicate what programs they accept, and we're able to list that they have X number of bedrooms, X number of bathrooms, and list these properties out so that you can see the different properties that are available. We also have a portal for property managers to log in and list their own properties and add pictures to them when they're available, what vouchers they accept, if there's any like particular ones that they work with. And they're able to manage their open applications in the platform itself. So they're able to set up applications for housing navigators to submit on behalf of different households. All right. One thing we get asked often is, do you integrate with HMIS? Do you talk to HMIS? How is this information passed through to HMIS? And the answer is yes, we do integrate with HMIS. But I want to give a little bit of background on and this is a little esoteric, but I want to give a little background about the technical details of an HMIS integration. You probably won't find many other people including an HMIS integration package because it's very, very difficult. There's something called in software engineering called an API. And an API stands for Application Programming Interface. You might have heard this acronym before. And it's basically a way for 2 computer programs to communicate with one another. It's a protocol between 2 programs to exchange information in a standard way. And this is an important point to say because no HMIS that we know of has an externally open API. There's no structure for how 2 programs ought to talk to one another. So as a result, we do work with HMISs. We had to create our own system of integration using a mixture of browser automation and human supervision. It involves us becoming members of the COC, becoming trained in HMIS, becoming HMIS admins ourselves, and we get involved with the data advisory committee in your community. We talk to your agency's leadership to make sure that we have all the resources available to make this task possible. And we have a small team of data integrators to help us supervise the transfer of information from Outreach Grid to your HMIS on a nightly basis. And how it works is we handle deduplication. So if a record already exists in HMIS, we don't duplicate the client. That would be awful. And any project enrollment that was done in Outreach Grid gets pushed into HMIS so that the outreach worker, the case manager, whoever it is, they don't have to enter it in Outreach Grid and also in HMIS. They don't have to do that double entry. And how it works is we have a 1 to 2 month start with your community, and those in the first month and a half-ish, we get onboarded into to become HMIS admins. We start attending your data advisory meetings, and then we start rolling it out after we've coded it to make sure that we're passing data through in a right way, that we're doing the right data quality checks with your community, and we really sit with you, on a daily or on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis, however often your data folks meet, to make sure that we're doing it right. We want to make sure that the data is passed through correctly. So this is a 3 to 6 month rollout period. Right, and we become trained HMIS admins. In addition to HMIS integration, we also have tools to engage with contributors and applicants. Contributors are folks who, in an auxiliary way, might work with people experiencing homelessness, or they might see instances of homelessness in your community. They can create an incident on Outreach Grid as a contributor, and that gets pushed through into the Outreach Grid network for either a case manager to respond to or an outreach worker to respond to. We also have tools for applicants, and these are people experiencing homelessness or about to experience homelessness themselves. They can create an account on Outreach Grid and submit a request for service. So now I'll talk about some of the case studies that we've had with our communities, how we've helped our communities tackle fairly big challenges. So one such challenge, and I touched upon this earlier, is quantifying shelter reservation times. How quickly are we pushing folks through from outreach, from a street homelessness situation to a sheltered homelessness situation? How quickly are we pushing that through? So when we first started this project, there was no way to quantify this number. How the process worked was an outreach worker would encounter someone experiencing homelessness. They would ask them, do you want to go into a shelter? And then they would have to call in to a shelter. And then there were three outcomes of that. They either get them on the phone, which is great, or, and these are the other two that lead to infinite time. One is there's no one at the other end to pick up, or because they're just so swamped and super busy, or they have no beds available. And so that loop was, it went back to the outreach worker, and then the outreach worker had to call another shelter, and then this terrible loop continues, and it just continues. So there's no way of quantifying just how long it took for someone to get a shelter reservation and get an individual through. Now, when we first coded the feature and we deployed it and we launched it and trained folks on it, the first time that we did it, it came out to be 45 minutes. It took 45 minutes for an outreach worker, a public safety officer, to get a confirmation for their request, for a bed. After some additional training, after some additional courtesy calls, some tweaks to the platform, and this is based on feedback that we received from our communities, and I hope this shows that we continuously improve the platform. We improved it, and then after the course of 4 weeks, we got it down to less than 10 minutes. In less than 10 minutes, an outreach worker, a public safety officer was able to secure a bed to make good on the promise to the individual who was finally ready to go into a shelter and get them into a shelter. 10 minutes. I thought that was pretty fun. Secondly, we're able to make pit counts safer. So at one of the largest pit count events that we helped with, that Outreach Grid helped with, was they had 600 volunteers. 600 volunteers came together, and it was crazy. The jurisdiction was divided into like 40 different teams and 40 different parts. And one of the challenges that we had was, how do we make sure that for the places that had maybe some hazards or some dangers, that we were making sure that a public safety officer was accompanying that team. And so with really fast queries, we were, because we have hotspots per jurisdiction, we're able to see the different comments about the hotspots. And we were able to identify which jurisdictions and which teams we had to make sure that we were allocating a public safety officer to. And with this particular pit count, we were pulling in information from outreach teams, from encampment information that was already in Outreach Grid, and information that we stored from there, pulling them into the hotspot data for the pit count. So we were able to quickly identify, which one had hazards, which one had, points of interest that maybe we need a public safety officer for, and make sure that a public safety officer was accompanying that team. And as a result, no incidences, which is great. 600 people came back safely, returned with their stuff, and we were able to make it safer. We were able to make sure that they were going out with the right people. Thirdly, and this is more recent, in the city of San Antonio, they were trying to address emerging large encampments. So in the city itself, there were these large encampments that were popping up in the course of days, and this is happening in days. That's the scale of the problem. 20 to 30 people moving into these encampments. It's getting bigger and bigger. The tents are getting bigger. It's pushing into like neighborhood territory. They needed to address this issue quickly, and they needed to mobilize their new staff quickly, and be able to train them quickly on how to do these surveys and go out into the encampments to figure out who is in these encampments, so that they can figure out the appropriate services to push them towards. So they conducted a mini pit count. On the Tuesday, we received notification about this. By the Friday, we were able to deploy 81 questions, including branching logic of the questions, 81 questions, trained their new staff to do these surveys and deploy them by the Friday. And by Friday, they did their surveys, they collected the data, and then a week later, we produced the full report. And we cleaned it up and presented it to their group of data folks in the matter of 3 days. So that's kind of how quickly we're able to change pit count surveys. We were up until the evening of the count. We were changing the questions. There were new questions that were being added, different parties wanting to add in different questions. It ended up being a fairly long questionnaire, but we were able to add in new additions up until the final minute. And lastly, our last case study is that we eliminate double entry and double work. So as I mentioned earlier, Outreach Grid is able to push information from Outreach Grid into your HMIS. And so that eliminates double entry of information. But in this particular instance, an outreach worker was able to get information about a client, do the project enrollment, the HUD assessments in Outreach Grid. And then that evening during the nightly integrations, that information was pushed through into HMIS. And that morning, it just so happened that the case manager of this person was looking for him. And because there was this new entry that popped up, the case manager and the outreach worker were able to connect and talk about this client, ask, what resources did you give to him? Did you give him a bus pass? Did you give him this? Did you give him that? And sync on the work that was already done about this person, eliminating any risk of double work that could have been done for this client. And so that's outreach grid. How we usually work with our communities is we have different packages that are available on outreachgrid.com/pricing. We really work sincerely with our community, so we make it a point to have simple and transparent pricing. So we have 3 different tiers. We have our hero tier, our superhero, it's all superhero themed, hero tier, superhero, and elite team tiers for 10 user licenses for hero, 25 for superhero, and 50+ for elite. And you know, I want to make sure that our incentives are aligned, that we are useful to your users, that we are useful to your case managers, that we're useful to your outreach workers, your shelter operators, and that if it's useful to you, that you would get more licenses. We don't charge per question to add to a PIT count. We don't charge per assessment to add to the platform. We don't charge per PIT count or per custom report. Those are things, that's not how we want to do our operator business. We want to work to make the platform useful to you. And so custom things, new additions, those are things that we work with you to include. And all of the improvements that we make to the platform, that we have suggestions from another community, they get put into the platform at no extra charge to you. So, you know, if we have new changes that come from another community, we roll them out to you too, if you're ready for them, if you want them. And we give you guys a notification about that. And that's Outreach Grid. Thank you so much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. If you'll stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to see everybody's faces better. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute. I see Mickey. Go ahead, Mickey.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. That really is awesome. Looks very simple to use, something for many years, over a decade, have been looking for something like that. My question is, you speak about public safety professionals out, experienced people in the field, or another outreach worker out in the field doing that. Do you have any instances of a 211 center who also would maybe be receiving, you know, homeless calls and needing to connect that information? Is there any examples that you work, or other communities as examples that have that, or another helpline of sorts where they're not in person directly with the client in need of help?
That is a great question. And I had a feeling there would be a question like this because I prepared slides in it. Let me share my screen again.
Okay, great.
I just had a feeling. All right, I put this in the appendix because I wasn't sure if there were going to be questions about it, but I just had a feeling to prepare.
There is a lot of discussion on a national level with 211s regularly. Every time we gather together or have, this comes up. So that's why
okay.
For us.
Bueno, perfect. Thank you, Mickey. So in addition to all the other tools that I mentioned, we also have an incident management tool. So this is when you might not have all of the information about a client collected. You might just have, like, I saw an individual here and they have a red bandana, or they're wearing, you know, this kind of jeans or whatever, right? That you can log an incident of homelessness through our incident management tool. Fill out as much information as you can about the individual. It might not be the full set of, you know, the universal identifier element stuff, you know, whether they're interested in services or not. These are all customizable fields. And then that creates an incident for someone else to follow up upon, maybe an outreach team to go out to the location, to be dispatched to the location. And then once they have enrolled the client, or the client has, you know, moved into the proper intake process, they're doing like the full universal identifier elements form, they've filled out the release of information form, then you can associate this incident that was created to the new client, and then now that client has a whole record of different incidences that are associated to them. So that work, that incident is not lost. It's all in one system.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, as for a community that does that, we have a few communities that do that. Sorry, City of San Antonio, we have a hotline that we work with, who handles calls, and then they punch it into Outreach Grid. We also have we also use incidences to log incidences of homelessness, maybe not through a hotline, but just like through plain eyes observation to log that location, and then someone can follow up at a later time. That's also a use case that happens as well.
Hang on, Tiffany, I'm trying to read the chat and see. So the biggest issue with HMIS is the workflows or the actual workflows, and they're funding driven. However, the features of Outreach Grid are intuitive and would be extremely helpful. Okay. Any other questions?
It's probably too granular for this conversation, but the cost, so in addition to the cost of HMIS as a user, what then would be the cost to also, I understand the packages, 50 users. Is that something that would be that HLA would purchase and then would sell to the end users? And do we have a sense of what that cost would be?
April, so we do have a sense of the cost. In full transparency, the way this conversation started was looking at the challenges with family shelter and needing to have some kind of coordinated entry for family shelter. Trying to find solutions around that. At the same time, we have a work group of hospitals who meet regularly to talk about discharging clients and the challenges that they have, and the possibility of replicating the quarantine hotel hotline process in some kind of way, which even without knowing the full cost of that, because all of us kind of jumped in and did that, without funding, I can tell you that, at every agency that participated in that process, there was a real cost in staff time for that. So in having those conversations, trying to come up with other solutions, the hospital said they wanted to look for a platform to address their issue. At the time, we had just found Outreach Grid, and I said, let's look at this. So my intent would be, if this looks like it's something that's helpful, then maybe we have some conversations with our healthcare community about the possibility of helping us secure the cost for this and not having to push that on to end users. But all of that is negotiable, but that was my initial thought, was that, we had a healthcare system already looking for a solution. And maybe there was a way that, in addition to the reservation system, we got all these other features and could ask for some support for our community for that.
Mm-hmm. So I also want to talk a bit about how we've structured our packages. We do, I think in the previous conversation, in the previous presentation, someone mentioned, we have a hard time getting people to work together. One of the things that we work actively on with your community is bringing people together. Everyone has their own interests of like, I want this data to be collected. I want this thing to happen in a system. I want this thing to happen in a system. And we sit with you guys to figure out, okay, this is something that we can help you implement. This is something that we can remove the technical barriers for by building it in a very like user-friendly, intuitive manner into the system. That's how a lot of Outreach Grid's features came about. It was born from those kinds of conversations to reduce, barriers for non-collaboration. When it comes to the packages themselves, depending on the length of the contract, depending on the number of users that are going to become part of the Outreach Grid network, the price does come down. There's like bulk pricing to it, there's discounts to it. So there are ways to bring down the cost.
I'm curious, Tiffany, it looks like a great product, and I appreciated you speaking on the HMIS integration. I'm curious about other software integration. I think maybe to the conversation April's having in terms of the double entry that a lot of agencies have to do, but looking at the healthcare side of it also, whether you integrate with EHR programs, what the sort of capabilities are there.
So it's a lot easier to do if they have an API. I'll say that much. Data can always come through. We can always add custom assessments so that you can collect certain information about a client. And then passing that through requires some work on our part, but if there's an open API to do it, that's like A+. We're happy about that. And that's something that we sit with you during those weekly calls to prioritize. Like, we want to make sure that data gets integrated into HMIS first. And then we want to get data integrated into this system and then that system so that we can reduce a double entry period. So the first hurdle that we usually come across with our communities is HMIS. That's like the first one. EHR, that's not something that we've done. We haven't done that right now, but I'll give you a little background about what I did before doing Outreach Grid. I worked at a company called Instacart. We were like 30 folks in a house, in a 3-story house. And we were just starting out. And one of the systems that I worked on as a software engineer there was a data integration pipeline to get. Oh, first of all, Instacart is a grocery delivery company. So you choose groceries and then they deliver it to you. So the data integration pipeline means that I need to get information from the mom and pop shop in New York to the Target in San Francisco and be able to integrate everything in between into Outreach Grids, not Outreach Grid, into Instacart, so that the end user knows that if I get cheese from Target, it is at this price today. That like Herculean effort, obviously not by myself, with my team, was we had to create our own like custom integrations per type of grocery store. Mom and pop shops, they still did it on like pen and paper. So we had our way of integrating with them. Some people had more sophisticated Excel spreadsheets. We integrated with them. Some people had sophisticated APIs and we integrated with them. So I like to say that anything in computer engineering is possible. We just need to know the rules of it. And if you say that EHR is our priority next, that's something that we're going to put in our weekly to-dos, in our weekly project management to-dos. And depending on the package that you choose, we have time allotted for development per week. So depending on how big the project is, it might take 2 weeks, it might take 4 weeks, and those are things that we size out with you, and we tell you like, oh, if we want a new type of notification, that will take 3 days. If you want to do an integration, that might take probably 6 weeks or more, depending on the type of integration. So nothing in computer engineering is impossible. Everything can be done. And custom integrations are included in the license fees.
Any other questions? I'm looking, I don't see that we have any emergency shelter providers on the call. I was curious about, their thoughts as an emergency shelter provider, the bed reservation system, but we're recording today, so we'll be able to share that with them and get some feedback. Tiffany, thank you so much. I don't see any more hands. If questions come up, I'll be sure to email you, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Bye-bye.
Okay, so normally we would end at 4:30. We had extended today to have some time for discussion since you had 2 long presentations. Curious who wants to kick us off?
Amy, what would we like to accomplish in the time that we have left together? Are we trying to come to an agreement about the first presentation? When would that go to the board, for example?
Great question. So that was new information from Jake today, that there is a cap and that they would need to know in the next couple of weeks. So I would want this to go to the HLA board for their July meeting. I'm almost worried that's too late, which is July 9th, I believe. We do not have an executive committee scheduled until August 17th. And so we might need to, bring this forward to an executive committee if we think that July is too late, because I heard from him we need to make that decision sooner rather than later. And we do not have a quorum to make a decision here today. But I do think having so many voices on the call today does still matter and would help either the executive committee or board move this forward. So I do not believe that we would need to make a decision today, that we would have to choose which audience we would want to serve with Built for Zero. I think that's a process we can do together with Built for Zero after we agree to move forward. So minimally, I think recommendation that we participate as a community in Built for Zero would be important for us to get some kind of formal action that Built for Zero would honor by the time we have a board meeting in July.
I think we should participate. I think we need the energy and the momentum as a community.
Yeah, not just the energy and the momentum, I agree, Kevin, but the just the knowledge swell of
exactly.
of 115 communities. Their model for change is one that just really, as a provider, speaks to me. I just have to say it felt, I don't know what word I want to use. It's going to sound clinical, but it just felt safe. It felt like we're all in this together and we're not trying to eliminate providers. We're not trying to pit them against each other. We're not trying to, some of these change models are not nearly as inclusive as that presentation felt, which is, we're all in this together. We rise together, we fall together kind of deal, as opposed to, someone's going to come out on top and everybody else is going to. And just the way the concept of it, as we think about homelessness, I have to say, in my mind, it deviated a little bit from some of the technical assistance we've received over the years, or at least that's the lens in which I was hearing it from some of our technical assistance providers that have encouraged us to think about, for example, eliminating emergency shelter beds in order to force the issue. Anyway, I am in favor of moving forward with it as well. I have a little anxiety about the group that we choose, and would be interested ultimately in that conversation. The other thing I have an interest in is that you said that you've already secured the funding. If it were to move forward, that you've already secured the funding. I would be interested to hear from Jake around, is there benefit to all of us contributing to the cost? Back to, they didn't used to have a cost, and then they had a cost because people weren't really fully buying in. I think that dynamic is true of a lot of things, and I just wonder if we collectively wouldn't, even if the fee was nominal, do we buy into this process?
I think those are great points. I saw Julie and then Duggan.
Hi, thanks, Amy. I was just curious if we do opt to choose this model, November, December, I mean, I know it's not far, but it is far, 5 or 6 months away. Do they have like a template of what you do to prepare to be a community prepared for this work to show
Yeah,
up?
so I think some of the first steps that they would work with us on is some of the questions that April just asked, right? So we have to have an agreement as a community that we want to have a shared aim and we want to work towards functional zero. And then they would work with us on choosing, is that veterans, is it chronic, looking at our data, helping us determine what that project group should look like, who might be the right players in that. I will tell you that in the HLA strategic plan, which I did put in the chat, that's going to the board tomorrow, they've seen one preview of that so far. There is a goal in there that we'd have a cohort of people go through a trust building exercise in preparation for Built for Zero. That wasn't something that Built for Zero necessarily recommended, but we talked a lot about kind of the foundation that needs to be in place in a community. And I think that would only make us stronger to be ready to embark on that work. So whoever we choose to be at the table, then we'd have a few months to get that scheduled and bring somebody in to work with us on that. So I think there's plenty to be done in the next couple of months, Julie. I started talking to him a couple months ago, and their May cohort just started. So as slow as things move, I think even if you made the decision today, it would take us till November, December to be ready. Okay, how about Duggan?
I think it's something that we should do. I think our, as a COC, we're really oriented to compliance. And I think that's the direction that, when so much is funded by HUD and systems are designed by HUD, we focus on compliance. And I think it was Sam's question that really kind of broke it open for me about how do you involve the wider community. And if we can get the help from a group like Built for Zero to help us get more focused around our concrete goal, which is to end homelessness, and sort of orient us in that direction collectively, I think it's going to help us move. Compliance is important, but compliance is not helping us toward our goal completely. And I think we'd be able to reorient ourselves in a way that the community, the larger community, can better understand how we're working together to end homelessness. I was impressed by sort of the simplicity that they bring to this. And I think about how often we explain our homeless system is complicated and there are all these moving parts and there's all these providers. And I think that helps sharpen the focus on the people who need us the most and helps us get to the goal of ending homelessness for our community.
Duggan, one of the things that you said made me think about when I talked to Jake, one of the things we talked about is there's kind of 3 distinct cohorts, and you move through them and there's not a defined period of time. So if we as a COC are better on our data quality than another COC, we can move through that first group quicker than someone else. But the strategies and tools in the toolbox are not held back for you to get to some milestone to test that tool. So if there is something that some other community is doing that is working really well and we hear about it through our group work, we would be able to adapt and adopt something, even if it wasn't something that was presented until a future cohort. I think the other thing, what you said made me think about Julie's question. One of the things that I'd like to see us do in the next couple of months is really map our system. I think one of the challenges I have found we have is understanding how many steps it takes for somebody to go from unhoused to being housed. And nobody created that system but us and funders, right? So we can uncreate that. If it's too complicated, we need to unpack it and figure out a better way to do it if possible. So, you know, those aren't overnight solutions, but I think that's another process that we could spend time in a strategic planning committee doing as we prep for Built for Zero is, you know, what does that exactly look like? Because I don't think we all hold a piece, and I don't think we all have seen the entire 400 steps and then understand why we're not housing people quickly enough.
Well, the other thing is that one of the things that I would hope would come out of it is just some consensus building about a whole variety of things, to use your words about mapping it, getting consensus after we've mapped it, getting some consensus on each of these stages and phases. You know, one of the things that in outreach, jurisdictional street outreach, one of the things that we need is some consensus on street outreach. And we use these terms, street outreach, and nobody is using those words the same. So if every one of us used the word street outreach on this call, we would all mean something different. And yet we're all using the same words, and we think that we're all having the same conversation, and we aren't. And right now, you know, to me, there is nothing more disheartening about trying to end homelessness or making it rare, brief, and one time. And yet we have 4, if we're lucky, jurisdictional street outreach teams, which are married to a jurisdiction and are in fact married to people moving out of sight, out of mind. It is not an exercise in reducing, eliminating, or ending homelessness. That is just not what that is about. And you know, we need to get consensus. We need to get consensus in a lot of places, but you know, we need to get consensus in street outreach. For example, we don't have street outreach. You know, I just want to say constantly, we don't actually have street outreach, but nonetheless, I would hope that by participating and spending the next several months kind of getting shared language and getting shared understanding, and then the ultimate being just a shared aim, just feels motivating.
Okay, anybody else? We can't take official action today, but I think so far it sounds like there's building consensus for moving this forward. I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay, so the second item, my proposed action on this would be, if you want us to continue to explore this idea of outreach grid and explore funding opportunities that, you know, may or may not be available to address this, or if you have specific questions that you want us to bring back and talk to outreach grid about, wanted to see your thoughts around that.
You know, Amy, one of the things that Kevin and I were kind of chatting about really is some of the work that we're also doing around the VI SPDAT. And is there some nexus between what outreach grid has available, can build? Is there a process in which we could also dovetail a new or our same but modified vulnerability assessment? Could that then be a part of it?
Yes, so you can custom build workflows in Outreach Grid, just like you can in HMIS, to give everybody kind of an update of where we are on the assessment piece. Is that we have not found any communities using one assessment that they can recognize or recommend across the country. And so we are still going to bring that back to the group that has decided they want to work on that. But I think we may need to build something locally to address that. And we want to get input from you about what types of criteria you think should be built into it. We have had conversations with one of our funders about repurposing some money that is not currently being spent towards a researcher to help with that work. And we've identified somebody who's already familiar with the homeless system that may be available to help with that work. So, you know, we were hopeful we'd find something out there that other people were using, and there's not one tool. So I think the good news of that is that, you know, we've been innovators in many ways in our community. And I think we have the opportunity to build something that may work for us. So yes, once we know what assessment we want to use, whether that's somebody else's or our own, then it could be custom built into it.
I just also wonder through the first project, what those other 110 communities have been doing as it relates to coordinated entry, and what could we or will we learn through that process that can help with our decision making and thinking, you know, because part of zero is having a fine-tuned coordinated entry.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, that's a really good follow-up question. I'm going to put it on my list to talk to Jake about.
I wish I would have asked him. It was a kind of an afterthought when he left.
It makes sense though that if they have this shared commitment that we have towards the equity conversation, and I mean, they actually were explicit enough the first time we met to say, we do not consider it success if you house a whole bunch of people and then we look at the data and see you've left one group behind. They may, you know, have some examples of what others are using. So I'm going to follow up and ask him that. Great question. Mickey?
So back to kind of the outreach grid conversation, I would like to have more conversation, particularly as the front door, really out here on the access side. It was really intriguing for me that a law enforcement officer or a street outreach team could see, or 211 could see if 211 they had contacted 211. 211 could see if they're actually been involved with outreach or a law enforcement officer, just from that. And then the reduction of double entry for HMIS, and we would have all that information more that would be seamless with the API every evening. And then, you know, just as a start to it. And then, yes, kind of the next step of getting into shelter. But there's so much that I saw that could be for all those access points to be able sharing that information. You know, I would really love to further the conversation on that.
Thanks, Mickey. That gives me some ideas to follow up with her on to understand better. Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was innovative, and I think that continuing the conversation would be helpful. I got the sense, and tell me if I missed something here, they seem to be rather newer, right? A lot of this happened over the last year or so. Do we know if there's anyone else out there like them that is in this space, or experience of people who are working with them? Just in terms of their capacity versus what Pinellas would bring to them kind of in a rapid growth scenario, and what they could reasonably handle.
So Jennifer, there are some other COCs working with them. There's lots of counties and cities working with them as well. So that's something we can explore more, but we have had some of that conversation because it is, you know, a newer organization. We did have some conversation initially with them about capacity, like server capacity. what that would look like, which is one of the reasons they push everything at night. They do have the ability at a different cost for you to have your own server to do real-time pushes. And that was a cost they were willing to explore as well. But definitely something to think about, but there are other organizations. I will tell you from the other software platforms that I've looked at, they all do single parts of this, right? So there's something that many COCs are using called Pad Mission, which helps secure landlords and other things. They cost almost as much for that one feature. So out of all the software integrations that I've looked at, it's the only one that can write to HMIS because of that whole API issue that we've been talking about as a community for a long time. And it has multiple components that could be useful in our community for the same price as one component of another. Julie's asking about the Built for Zero presentation. Julie, I will ask him about that. I do think, you know, they probably have proprietary information in there because I haven't been able to get a copy before, but certainly this is recorded. So we'll send the recording link out and I'll see if he's willing to share his slides. Anything else are quiet today?
Amy, I just want to say something. I want to thank you and Margie for allowing me to be a part of this today. This has been awesome. Thank you.
I wanted to actually call Mick out. So for those of you who don't know Mick sits on the HLA board. And I'm really proud that in all these special presentations we've had in the last couple of months, you know, whether that's HMIS or the race equity data, someone from the HLA board has chosen to participate in these COC conversations as well as their HLA board duties. And I was really excited to have Mick here today to hear directly from Built for Zero. So thank you, Mick, for your service.
I'm a neophyte, guys, on all this stuff. This has been really educational for me as well.
Anybody else?
I just want to make sure we don't lose momentum with both of these conversations, but in particular, Built for Zero. So, you know, whatever we need to do next, you know, I don't know what 7 spots left means. I don't know if that could, you know, fill up overnight, or if that's, or if, you know, we have time to do things or what.
Yeah, I mean, I think, April, just for my own comfort, because, you know, there's a lot of interest in this organization considering the $100 million investment. I think we should call an emergency executive committee meeting and go ahead and have that decision made and then ratified at the board meeting in July. I think that's probably just the safest bet, so that we can get them a firm answer back.
I mean, do our bylaws, thinking to the main board, because I'm kind of going with what April said too, is I don't know right off the top of my head, I don't know the date of the July meeting, and I guess I can look at my calendar and see, but are we able to call an emergency meeting if we needed to? I mean, are we looking at July 9th?
July 9th is our board meeting, but your charter allows the executive committee to make decisions in absence of the board and then to just have it ratified at the next board meeting. So we'd probably have better luck trying to get that small group together and get a quorum there. So that might be what we'll do.
Okay.
Okay, well, I know no one is ever sad about getting time back. And we're pretty close to where we should have been if we didn't extend the meeting. So thank you, everybody, today. I know it was a lot of information and a lot of listening, but I'm really excited about the possibility of moving forward with both of these projects. And excited for you to be a part of that.
Yes, I am too. Thank you, Amy, for this. It was really helpful.
Okay, bye everybody. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.